That's a better one.
You got there in the end. Where does non-duality sit in the... Where does non-duality sit in the kind of body of other religions? Does it reject them? Does it sit there with them? Is it what they're all pointing to?
It doesn't really have a position to be like positioned within a tomb of thinking. To me personally, I hear echoes of it in all the different religions, from aspects of those religions, because it can't be written in words, or it can't be written into a text or into a book. So it's slightly problematic. So it can't be recorded, and so it can't be contrasted then with other texts. So to me, all religions are like poetry. They're an effort of the human mind to point to something which can't be put into words. Obviously, there's aspects of religion as well which are very human. You could say very political, to do with power. And again, non-duality is problematic to that sort of narrative, because you can't build a structure on top of non-duality that can be packaged and shared with others, or others told to follow this narrative. These guidelines or these commandments. It doesn't fall within that type of thinking. So, at the end of the day, to me, non-duality includes all religious thinking or spiritual thinking, and indeed all of human thinking. And yet religion or spirituality, and even the individual person, that type of thinking will reject non-duality. Because if it is really heard, it like pulls the carpet from underneath the feet of any structure, and that includes, political thinking, religious thinking, spiritual thinking, personal identity. So it's slightly problematic to all those structures, and yet there's no need. Non-duality doesn't need to renounce any of those structures. Because there's no movement in non-duality which, in a sense, is rejecting or accepting any conceptual narrative.
You once told me that, in a slightly tongue-in-cheek manner, so probably more as a joke than anything, but I think it's an interesting question. You once said that the purpose of all philosophical questions is to answer all your other philosophical questions. Is that pointing to this pointlessness of the question asking?
Well, it's not pointlessness. The flavour of what I call the ocean. It doesn't need to have a point. but it can appear to be a point. But at the end of the day, all conceptual thinking, because all thinking is born out of relationships, out of a contrast between two things, basically out of time and space. But what's being suggested is that there's another possibility that time and space isn't an appropriate measurement of it. It's actually not measurable in that normal sense of knowledge because there's no contrast, there's no other thing for there to be a relational contrast in which we can knowledge. It's prior and runs through all conceptual thinking. It's in the words and also equally in the silence. It's not that the words can contain it more so or less so. And likewise the silence. The words and the silence are both singing, not two.
There's a fullness in the silence, and also a complete emptiness in the silence. Would that make sense?
Well, no, conceptually, none of those words, we use them poetically in an effort to share, in a sense, to share a love affair. It just bubbles out of characters. But all those concepts are like data points, but only exist in a contrast to the opposite. So no data point can be given to say that it's empty. Yes, no. To say it's full. Well, yes, no. It's almost like every question can have a yes-no answer to it in a way.
Yeah.
It's like whatever you state is like a partial truth or a partial take.
Do you ever feel that it can be some questions or some statements are more truthful than, if it's all a part truth, can some questions be more truthful than others, and then does that not imply that the most truthful of all partial truth questions could be the truth?
Well, it's just a way of trying to express that in this, nothing has to or needs to be rejected.
Okay.
So but sometimes when you read things or hear things or see things, it's just some things just seem, the word I tend to use is like there's a fuller truth as opposed to a partial truth. And it's I don't know why my body will just go, oh yeah. But again, this wetness, which is everything, this ocean, this luminosity, is not more or less diminished by whatever form appears, whether that form is a visual form or a linguistic form or a conceptual form. It's at some point, in one sense, the physiology will vomit them all out as not being needed. But there can be no other, because the individual works and lives in a narrative through time. Without that story, you can't maintain that sort of identity. If the story collapses, the identity collapses, and vice versa. So we can only communicate in time and space, in a story of relationships, of contrasts, ever changing. And so we just keep moving round. I used to have a dear friend, he's passed away now, that lived in the monastery with me. And he used to get really frustrated with all the talking, because we used to have all these delegations coming from around the world to discuss what the truth is from the world religions. And I don't know where, I think he heard it or read it somewhere, but somebody said somewhere, it was like blind men in a dark room knitting with spaghetti. And that has a sort of flavour, you know, when you get too deep.
Yeah.
You know, and that can be quite addictive as well. And it can be, you know, with regard to this topic, it can only end in frustration, because the concept is like trying to grasp the air. The concept just can't grasp what it's trying to grasp. Because again, you know, it's an unsuitable tool to use. It's not needed. It's prior to concepts. And yet concepts don't diminish or enhance it.
Is that then why the Zen koans took it so humorously in a lot of its... Because it was almost like the opposite of sitting in a room knitting with spaghetti. It was just it's very short, piffy, pointing to nothing really, just...
Well, they're a braking mechanism, like meditation.
Yeah.
They're designed for there not to be an answer. It's designed to break the question into a different possibility. So through the ages, you know, humans and cultures have developed, you know, it's like music, different music to try to grasp something that can't be grasped conceptually. But they still use the tool they have at their disposal, which is movement. And indeed, sometimes it's just physical movement, like dance, or like the whirling Sufis. You know, there's lots of physiological movements, even fasting and whatever, or the use of pharmaceuticals to change the physiology. Or there can be more like mental techniques, like in Raja Yoga, which are more to do with concentration. You know, you use concentration and everything to master the mind, like riding a wild horse and to rein it in, to get it to do what you want to do, in the hope that it can break this real illusion that there is a separate something. And I'm sure new humans will develop new theories and new techniques and technologies these days that will always be two-edged, like talking. You know, talking can create more confusion, or it can create mental clarity. So all these techniques can create a change of state. But fundamentally, what we're talking about isn't a state. So just like words are an inappropriate tool, all these techniques, at the end of the day, are an inappropriate tool. But the individual, the apparent individual, can only function, as we said, in a movement called a story, in an action. So that will always be the case. Because even to say I'm not going to do anything is still an action.
Mm. Alan Watts spoke, and I think the Buddha as well, about the trickiness of desire. And it's many people want to meditate to achieve a certain mind state or enlightenment, but by almost desiring that enlightenment, it's like putting themselves in it. It's an I want this thing again. And it seems like this difficult loop, because it's almost like to achieve enlightenment, or whatever that means, or to get to the closer truth of it, it feels paradoxical, because it's like trying to desire without desire, and that's, yeah, it seems like a pain in the ass.
Well, it's an impossibility.
Yeah.
It's like trying to see your own absence. It's the one thing that the what we call the mind can't do. So it's always going to end in frustration, because the premise, the start point, is already sort of like entered Alice in Wonderland world, because it feels that the start point is a something in time and space, and we give it a name called me. That feels very unsatisfactory. It's very unsatisfactory to be separate from a tree, or from a cup of coffee, or from your beloved.
I always find it difficult to be separate from a cup of coffee. Yeah. That's the tricky one. Forget the beloved. That coffee is key.
So perhaps that's your path. You follow the coffee path.
Shwami Shrupa Coffee Nanda.
Yeah, that would be your shortcut.
Yeah. The version of life without a story. I was thinking about this earlier. Our identities are somewhat a social technology as well as a survival technology. It's really helpful if you know that when Claire arrives in the office tomorrow, you know roughly what Claire is like, her behaviour, her preferences, her quirks, idiosyncrasies. You know how to orient yourself around Claire when Claire walks into the room. There's a level of consistency of her identity story over time. When that story falls away, is there difficulty in integrating in society because there's less stickiness on consistency for your friends and family?
Again, there's no, the issue isn't the story. It's that sense of an energetic center called me that owns that story. Is the angsty bit? Is the dissatisfaction? And it's designed, when you look at the patterns, it's designed to be in a constant state of dissatisfaction, because it has to move, basically. So it's not that the story falls away, it's just that which thinks it has a story falls away. So in one sense, nothing changes. Although in another sense, everything changes. because there's the past in the story and the future fundamentally have no gap then. There's what was, what is, and what will be has the same wetness. So there's constant change, but there is no something that changes. So the story carries on as normal. If that physiology, that character is has cancer, then that physiology will odds on continue to have cancer or have the foibles that that character has. But they do tend to become less sticky because the story is less, there's nobody taking ownership of the story. So there can still be the whole range of emotions. Like a wave in the ocean, it emerges and disappears. Whereas we tend to hold on to that story, that sense of a something, very strongly, because we use that in an effort to continually to try to predict the future. And that continues to go on as well. It's just that it's almost like a little bit of software that's added on to all of that there is a separate something that is the mover. But, at the end of the day, what happens if there's a movement, whatever that movement is, whether it's thinking, emotional, physiological. So there's ever-changing movements. So what happens if there's a movement, but there is no separate something, which is a mover? It's like, what's wrong with the movement?
It feels like a new perspective, but I know to have a new perspective, the perspective must be coming from a perceiver or perspectiver. I don't know if that's a word. So that has to be a wrong framing, because that new piece of software analogy, it feels like you're now just seeing the movement in a new light, shall we say. But even that feels very agentic, very subject-object, very identity-fueled.
Totally. Because in a sense, the wetness, the luminosity comes from everything. It's like you talked a bit earlier about identity. Identity is a very dynamic emergence, and the input to create that identity are, simplistically put, are two edges. One edge is your subjective landscape, and one is your objective landscape. They both dynamically feed into that whirlpool, which emerges that name and form called Paul or Theo. If you change either, the identity changes. If you put powerful pharmaceuticals in or alcohol, it changes the landscape and changes the identity. Likewise, if you're sat here and your mother sits next to you or your lover sits next to you, your identity is a very different identity. The same, if our landscape was a lot harsher or there were big threats around us, your identity would be different. Because again, identity isn't. It's a multifaceted. It's a bit like a committee, where there's lots of characters, lots of patterns, basically, and all these patterns are literally inputted into that identity. You are literally that which is sitting here, and also that which you're perceiving. there are not two. So it's, in that sense, there's no, as you just said, there's no different perspective. It's just everything sings this perspective, and there's no movement. There's no up or down, past or future, birth or death. There's no opposites to be found, and that's almost impossible for the data point in time and space to understand or grasp, because it feels it's a something. It can only see other somethings and a perspective, basically. Whereas that can collapse. And there's... But that re-emerges, the body still functions in constant measurements. Otherwise, it just wouldn't survive. But there's no thing taking ownership. There's a movement, but no separate something which is a mover. It's self-obvious that there is no separate something, whether a subject or an object. There's no gap. In a sense, all the edges are edgeless.
So there's a feeling of not connectedness. Or is it connectedness? Like, unity maybe is the wrong word, because we was talking about non-duality. Not two, rather than uni meaning one.
But even the word "not two" is
Can we accept anything in this house?
no, none. It can't be conceptualized. All the opposites are really extremes. Whereas the ocean is just simply what is. It's not an extreme. It doesn't need to go to extremes. It doesn't need to go to, subject-object is an extreme. It's not two, and yet it's not one. I often say, I do apologize, but you have to be, you can listen to these words, but you have to be really careful to put them all in a bin.
Yeah. Okay, that was good. I'll leave it there. Nice. Oh, fed up looking at the sun.